Hello Year 10 and welcome to this summary of The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Why do we call him that strange sounding name, Alfred Lord Tennyson, not just Alfred Tennyson? Well, that's because he was given a peerage by Queen Victoria because of his services to poetry. He was made Lord Tennyson by the Queen, and he was also made the Poet Laureate by the Queen. So he was seen as one of the great poets of the 1800s. And so he was very famous when he wrote this poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, in 1854. So let's start just by summing up the context of this poem. Why and when was it written? And what's the kind of overall message of the poem? Well, in October 1854, during the Crimean War, which was a war against Russia, the Light Brigade, who were a group of soldiers who rode horses into battle, were told to attack the Russian troops, despite the fact that they were outnumbered and outgunned. So there were many more Russian troops. The Russians had a very dangerous artillery, so they had lots of very powerful guns and cannons. It seemed really obvious that these soldiers on horses were very vulnerable, that there was no way they could win riding into this attack, but they were told to attack anyway. And the Light Brigade rode into battle, followed their orders, rode at the Russian guns, and as a result, many of them were killed. Just 6 weeks later, Tennyson wrote this poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and published it. He seemed to want to praise the bravery of the Light Brigade, the actual soldiers themselves, these men on horses who rode into the danger and lost their lives. But he also seems to be quite critical of the commanders who made this very strange decision to send them into this attack, despite the fact it seemed obvious that they were going to die. And so what we can say about this poem is that it is ambiguous. Really good word to use in our analysis, ambiguous. It means that, it's not black and white. It's not one thing or the other. It's not completely clear. Unlike a poem like Bayonet Charge or Exposure, those poems are completely negative, aren't they, about the war? If we read Bayonet Charge, we can't really see any positives in the way that the war is being presented or that being a soldier is being presented. And the same in Exposure. Those soldiers come across as very weak, very frightened. We sympathize with them, we pity them, but we don't probably really admire them or see them as brave or strong. Whereas in The Charge of the Light Brigade, we are definitely supposed to see these soldiers as brave and strong and heroic. But at the same time, we're shown that it's quite unfair that they died the way they did, quite a waste that they died the way they did, because they were told to attack when there was no chance of winning. So we can say that the Charge of the Light Brigade is quite ambiguous in its attitude towards war. We admire the bravery and the heroism of the soldiers, but at the same time, we think that they died in quite an unfair, maybe quite a pointless way. So when we're thinking about how we could compare it to some of the other poems in the collection, that's the distinction that we can make, I think, is that poems like Bayonet Charge, Exposure, Remains, War Photographer, I don't really see any positivity about war at all in those poems, whereas in The Charge of the Light Brigade, there is a sense of positivity, at least in terms of the way the soldiers themselves are presented. Another really good word for this poem that we can use is we can say it shows the soldiers in a hagiographic way, or we could say it paints a hagiographic picture. This is where we describe someone's life in a way that makes them seem almost like a saint. So we can see these soldiers as kind of like saints. They're presented in an almost religious way. We're almost perhaps supposed to worship these soldiers for the bravery they showed. Now we can disagree with that, and it's good to disagree with that if we want to in our analysis. We don't have to agree that, a soldier can be seen in this kind of saintly, perfect way. But I think it's quite clear that that's how Tennyson, the poet, wants us to see them. And we'll see how he shows that as we go through the poem. So let's start by looking at the structure of the poem briefly, because we know that for the highest marks on this exam, we want to analyze structure as well as language. One thing we notice straight away, there's 6 stanzas in this poem. And one thing we notice straight away is that there's a kind of similar structure to the first 5 stanzas. If we look at the stanzas, the first 3 lines always have 6 or 7 syllables, and they're in a very kind of set rhythm, that half a league, half a league, half a league onward. There's this rhythm that creates a sense of the horse's hooves. It's almost the rhythm showing the galloping of the horses. And I think that what that shows is the soldiers keeping going, bravely carrying on, galloping into the attack, despite the danger that they're facing. So the whole poem kind of replicates the rhythm of the Light Brigade. And because of that, it kind of shows their bravery, the way they keep riding, they keep going, despite all the danger they're facing. Another structural feature is the use of a refrain. So a refrain is a key word or phrase that keeps repeating over the course of a poem. And in this case, we can see it, can't we, at the end of each of those first 3 stanzas, rode the 600. Into the valley of death, rode the 600. Those same 2 lines are repeated at the end of the first 3 stanzas. And again, I think it shows that the kind of determination of the soldiers, and the fact that they keep going despite the insurmountable odds they are facing. What that means is then at the end of the 4th stanza, when there's a change to not the 600, then they rode back, but not the 600, that really stands out. We suddenly really notice that contrast because we become so used in the first 3 stanzas to hearing into the valley of death rode the 600. When we get at the end of the 4th stanza, not the 600, that really jumps out at us, and it creates this sense of sadness because we know that what's happened is that many of those soldiers have been killed. And all of that kind of determination and bravery from the first 3 stanzas has ended in the death of most of the Light Brigade. So there's a kind of sadness there. Let's look at some of the language then in the poem. Let's look at how the language creates a sense of danger and a sense of fear and terror because of the dangers that the soldiers are facing, but also how it shows their bravery and how it almost paints them in that hagiographic way that we talked about. I'm not going to pick out every example of language throughout the whole poem. I'm going to be selective, and part of the skill in your revision is to look at the examples that I'm giving here and then find other examples of your own. It's not about only using the examples of language that I'm showing you, but here are some examples of how Tennyson gets his point across about the bravery of these soldiers. In the first stanza, there is a really significant image which is repeated twice, the valley of death. Now, first of all, obviously, valley of death just shows the terrifying situation that they're riding into, but it's also biblical imagery. It's a reference to the Bible. In Psalm 23 of the Bible, it refers to the valley of the shadow of death. And so, knowing that he is appealing to a Christian audience in 1800s Britain, and he's banking on them recognizing that reference, we can assume that Tennyson here is trying to show the importance, the significance of what these soldiers did when they rode into this battle. He's kind of making them seem like saintly figures, maybe suggesting that they're on the side of God, and almost that they are facing Satan. They are the kind of the righteous soldiers riding into this battle and almost riding into hell, almost kind of facing the forces of evil, the forces of darkness. So the valley of death is a really significant image in the poem. Also, let's just come back to that repetition of rode the 600. The fact they're always referred to as the 600, they're not referred to as individuals, but they're referred to as this one number, this one group. It shows the unity and togetherness of the soldiers. You're probably familiar with the idea of a band of brothers, which was originally from Shakespeare, of soldiers as like brothers, that togetherness, that sense of loyalty, that sense of duty to each other. And I think that's what Tennyson is bringing to mind when he keeps referring to them as a collective, as a group. of 600. He wants us to have that sense of 600 brothers almost riding together into battle. There's a real contrast then when he refers to the commanders who've made this decision to send them into battle. The soldiers are presented in this very brave, very heroic way, but when it describes the decision to send them into battle, it says someone had blundered. And that verb blundered, if you blunder, it means you're being quite clumsy, quite foolish. I almost think of a kind of clown with those big shoes stumbling around. And if you blunder, you're quite foolish, quite clown-like, quite daft, really. So the fact that someone had blundered to make this decision to send these brave men into battle is being quite critical of the commanders. It's showing the commanders who made this decision as quite foolish. And the contrast between the commanders and the soldiers kind of shows the unfairness of the situation. Why should these brave men, who are so professional and so strong and so well trained, why should they have to follow the orders of people who blunder and people who make mistakes? But they do follow orders. They do as they're told because that's their job. And here Tennyson uses anaphora, which is a kind of form of repetition where a key word is repeated at the start of each line. So if you see the example there, there's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. The anaphora, that repetition of that word at the start of each line, shows their determination, their willingness to follow those orders despite all the danger that they're in. There might not be any good reason for them to ride into this attack when it's so dangerous, but they are there to fight for their queen and their country, and so they're going to go into battle anyway. And that repetition at the start of each line, that anaphora, shows their determination and their courage. Okay, let's move on to the third and fourth stanzas. More anaphora here at the start of the third stanza. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them. You get that sense of them being surrounded, completely surrounded by these cannon, by these guns. There's no escape for them from this. So war here, a bit like in maybe bayonet charges, presented as something which is terrifying, which surrounds you, which leaves you unable to escape. And that anaphora, that repetition of cannon at the start of each line, is what gives us that effect. But the difference in this poem to, say, bayonet charge, where the soldier just panics and runs, is that these soldiers are presented as very brave and very professional, and they keep going despite all of that danger they're surrounded with. There's some alliteration here as well when it describes the actual firing of the cannon, stormed at with shot and shell. And if you look down actually into the fourth stanza, there's more of that alliteration. Reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. So alliteration here is used to show the kind of violence of the cannon firing, the violence of the battle, and how frightening it would have been. And then personification is really important in this poem. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell. That arrow is a little bit low because it's pointing at road the 600. It should be just a little bit higher. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell. So the enemy here, the Russian enemy, is almost, or the war itself is kind of personified as this mighty satanic figure. They're not just riding to face the enemy, they're facing this monster with jaws of death. They're riding into the mouth of hell. It's almost like they are facing some kind of almighty monster, or maybe they're facing the devil himself. And so again, you get that kind of sense of the soldiers as these saintly, innocent figures facing up against Satan, riding into hell itself on the orders of their commanders. So the personification is really important in creating that sense that they have no chance of survival. You can't escape from the jaws of death. You can't escape from the mouth of hell. But they're going to give it their best shot because that's what brave soldiers do in Tennyson's worldview. And finally, into the last two stanzas. before actually we get onto the final stanza, just you'll see in the fifth stanza lots of the same techniques that we've seen throughout the poem. The use of anaphora again, cannon, 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 showing how surrounded, how outnumbered they are, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Some of them come back. Some of them actually manage to survive and come through the jaws of death and back from the mouth of hell, but not many of them are left. All that was left of the 600 kind of come back after the battle, but the 600 have been destroyed. They've been lost as a group. And then we get into this final stanza, the sixth stanza, which is where Tennyson is talking about how he wants us to think about these soldiers, how he wants us to remember them. Look at the use of the rhetorical question. When can their glory fade? He's asking us, is it possible? This kind of glory, this kind of bravery, is that ever going to fade? Will it be possible to ever forget people who've done these incredible things in battle, rode to their certain death because it's what they thought was expected of them? How can we forget that glory? And then the repetition here of honor the charge they made, honor the Light Brigade. It's almost like he is kind of challenging us to disagree. He's saying, if you think that you can not honor these soldiers, if you think that their glory will fade, you tell me, but I don't think we should ever stop honoring them. I don't think their glory can ever fade. He's almost ordering us to praise them. It's almost like a challenge to the reader to think differently. Now, we can ask ourselves whether we agree with this. Do we think that it's right that the death of so many people in war should be remembered in the kind of positive way that Tennyson wants us to remember it? Someone like Wilfred Owen would disagree, wouldn't he? Wilfred Owen wants to show the horror of war, the pity of war. He wants us to think about war as a waste, as a tragedy, as a disaster for everyone involved. And Tennyson is definitely critical of the commanders. He said that they blundered. He kind of makes it clear that it's sad that these soldiers died in such a kind of pointless way when there was no way they could win. But he also wants us to celebrate their bravery, and I think that definitely sets him apart from Ted Hughes in Bayonet Charge or Wilfred Owen in Exposure, because they just want us to see the war as a terrible, pointless thing. They don't want us to have this kind of maybe more romantic idea of soldiers as heroes. And when you're making your comparisons, if you were to get Charge of the Light Brigade or Bayonet Charge on a exam question, that would be a good comparison to make between Tennyson and some of the other poems. The fact that Tennyson definitely does have this more romantic, this more idealized view of what it is to be a soldier.